Um, okay. Yeah, well, thanks everybody for I think third and final Lunch and Learn of spring 2025. Today we're going to be celebrating World Frog Day, which was yesterday, but better late than never, right? And we're going to be talking about all things frogs and toads. So, like I said, I'll probably talk for half an hour, 35 minutes or so. I'm going to start, we always like to start these talks. Since this is put on by the Eno River Association. By the way, I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Eli. I'm the AmeriCorps Education Program Coordinator here at the Eno River Association, and Audrey Gentry is our Education Manager, um, also in the meeting. Because we are the organization that puts on these lunch and learns, I like to start with just a little introduction to the Eno River Association and the Eno River in case anybody's not in the Durham area and is not familiar. And then we'll jump into frogs. I'm going to try to cover as much ground as I can in the time that we have and talk about frog biology and ecology and try to make it somewhat place-based, specific to the Eno River and to the Triangle. Um, but also talk a little bit about global issues facing frogs and global frog diversity. Um, and we'll try to leave plenty of time for questions and discussions at the end and try to get to everybody's questions. So with that, um, just an introduction to the Eno River Association. So we're a nonprofit land trust that was established in the 60s in response to pressures that the Eno River was facing at the time. There was the threat of encroaching development and also some dams being built along the river. And we started as a grassroots organization that was community led, and founded the nonprofit. And in the intervening 50 or 60 years, we've grown into a nonprofit that has, I think, 11 now full-time year-round staff, and we're still growing. We've got open positions right now, and a lot of seasonal staff. And our mission is to protect the natural, cultural, and historic resources of the Eno River Basin in Durham and Orange counties. So primarily how we do that is as a land trust. We buy land and protect it in perpetuity. Some of the land that we own and we manage as our own public nature preserves. Other land gets transferred to Eno River State Park. Um, Other land is protected in sort of private conservation easements. But we also do a lot of education and outreach work, both in schools and in public events and virtual events like this talk. Um, and we put on the festival for the Eno every July, which I hope some of y'all have been able to attend, or if not, might be able to attend this year because it's a good time. Um, just to situate us geographically, if anybody's not familiar, we talk about the Eno River. It starts up in Efland, north of Hillsborough, at the Confluence Natural Area, which is a nature preserve that is owned and operated by the Eno River Association. And the Eno River flows from there about 40 miles through northern Orange and Durham counties before emptying into Falls Lake. Um, and then after empties into the Neuse River and into the Atlantic Ocean. But we're here in the northern Piedmont of North Carolina, and the watershed takes up a good chunk of northern Durham and Orange counties. It's about 150 square miles. But we're here today to talk about frogs, which is something that's near and dear to my heart as a longtime herpetology enthusiast and nerd. Um, and I wanted to start with a picture of a green frog. It's one of our most common and widespread frogs, both in the Eno and in Eastern North America. And I think that when folks think of a frog, um, they usually think of something that looks kind of like this, sort of a, for lack of a better word, generic looking frog. Um, but I think it belies the diversity of frogs around the world. So frogs and toads make up the order Anura. So these Anurans, I'll be referring to them throughout this talk. Anurans are an incredibly diverse group of animals. There's like 7,800 species that we know of right now globally, and there's new ones that are being discovered all the time. And these 7,800 species make up almost 90% of all amphibians. So amphibians are the frogs and toads, and the salamanders and caecilians. And frogs and toads are almost 90% of amphibians. Now there's 7,800 species worldwide. We have about 300 in North America, about 28 in North Carolina. So just a tiny sliver of the frogs and toads of the world. But I just wanted to have this slide in here to show some of the diversity of these animals because they've been incredibly successful at evolving to fill a huge range of ecological niches. From this frog in the middle is called the Titicaca water frog. It's fully aquatic, lives in South America in one single lake. There's frogs that are adapted to be able to survive in brackish and even salt water. There's frogs like this Wallace's flying frog that can fly, or more accurately, they glide. It's still pretty cool. Um, this in the bottom right-hand corner here is a frog in New Guinea that's the smallest known vertebrate. It was discovered only about 10 years ago, and this is an adult on a dime. So tiny, tiny frog. And then all the way up to giant bullfrogs and these cane toads down here on the bottom left that can be really sort of approaching top predators in certain ecosystems. So huge range of frogs and toads and huge range of ecological roles that they fill in our ecosystems. So when we zoom into the Eno watershed, we don't have nearly that level of diversity, but we do have a pretty respectable diversity of anurans for such a small watershed. So we have about 14 species, so about half of what's in North Carolina. North Carolina has 28 species, about three of which are of conservation concern. We don't have any of the conservation concern species in the Eno, but we do have 14 species from five families. So that's a pretty significant amount of diversity that we've got in a small area. On the bottom, we have true frogs, so green frogs, leopard frogs, and on the right, Fowler's toads, so from our true toads. Those are probably what people run into the most often around here are the families of true frogs and true toads. Then if you go to the top left, um, is Hylidae. That's the family of tree frogs. So Cope's gray tree frog, green tree frog. And we'll talk about these species in a little more detail later. Um, Moving to the top middle, the microhylid frogs is the family. We only have one of those species along the Eno. It's called the eastern narrowmouth toad. They're pretty secretive and unusual, and they're called a toad. They're not a true toad. They're in a microhylid frog family, but they're called a toad. And similarly, in the top right, the eastern spadefoot toad, not a true toad. It's in a totally different family, but it's called a toad all the same. Both of these families, the microhylid frogs and the Scaphiopodidae, are represented by one species each in the Eno River watershed. So, and they're also quite rare and secretive in this area. I haven't seen either one of these around here, but they're here. Um, I wanted to talk real quick about the differences between frogs and toads, because some folks think of them sometimes a little bit interchangeably. Um, for the purposes of this, I'm going to talk about true frogs. So Ranidae is the family with bullfrogs and leopard frogs and whatnot. Faunidae left here is the same picture, that green frog that we used earlier. And on the right is an American toad. And there's some pretty differences, even though frogs and toads are pretty related. So frogs tend to have really thin, moist skin, and all amphibians, to one degree or another, have thin, moist skin, but actually permeable. And that means that they're often more closely tied to water than toads are. So they're more aquatic or semi-aquatic than toads are. They also tend to have these really long and powerful uh, muscular hind legs. Um, so when you think of a frog jumping a long distance, it's because it's got really powerful hind legs that are adapted for that purpose. Um, and they also are true frogs around here tend to lay egg masses, so not strings. A toad lays eggs in a string. Um, Toads also have this dry, warty skin. We think of it like warts. Um, these bumps here are actually that have toxins that make them unpalatable to predators. So these big bumps behind the eyes are called parotid glands, and they secrete a poison that's deters predators. I also have sort of stouter legs for crawling and hopping. When I was researching for this, I saw one website that said that frogs are lean and muscular and toads are squat and dumpy. And I don't think that's really fair to toads, which are, muscular in their own way, I guess, but to a lesser degree than frogs. They're often more terrestrial because they have this drier skin, um, often able to venture a little farther from aquatic environments. Um, and like I said, typically lay eggs in sort of strands or strings, at least our true toads around here. And I'll show some pictures of that in a minute. And when we think about anurans, at least in North America, when we tend to run into them the most is centered around frog reproduction, right? If you think about going out um, in the summertime and hearing calling frogs and or you see frogs and toads migrating across the river on a warm, rainy night in the springtime. It all has to do with frog reproduction. So I thought I would talk a little bit about that here. Um, so we've got two types, so two broad modes of anuran reproduction. There's prolonged breeding and explosive breeding. So prolonged breeding, I think, is what a lot of people think of. You go outside during the summertime and you hear bullfrogs calling, and they're calling for a lot of the summer over an extended period of time. They're breeding for an extended period of time. Those are prolonged breeders. And a counterpoint to that is a species like the American toad, which is shown here, um, that breeds really rapidly for a period of only like a few days, maybe a week. I'm hearing American toads like in the last few days around here calling. So they're breeding right now, but it's the breeding season is over really quickly. It seems to be triggered to me by like the first really warm week of spring is when what brings out the American toads. But they're explosive breeders. Everybody breeds at once and they're done. Um, so these frogs call. How a lot of people are familiar with frogs is hearing calls during the warmer months. It's the males that are calling, and they're doing this to both establish territories and attract mates. Um, and they are territorial during the breeding season. They'll fight off other males. Um, I'm not sure whether this guy over here that's watching this American toad is a male getting ready to do battle or a female who's interested. But I hope for this guy's sake that it's a female. There's some really interesting YouTube videos that I went down a YouTube rabbit hole watching some giant bullfrogs in Africa fight, and it's pretty entertaining. It's worth a watch. I almost put it in this power it. So you'll just have to trust me that they do uh, have some pretty intense territorial battles. And the mechanism for calling is that they um, pass air through their larynx, and it's magnified by this expandable vocal sac that you see on this spring peeper down here in this American toad. Um, and if you watch videos of frogs calling, which we'll do actually in a minute here, you can see them kind of pump themselves up before each call. It's pretty entertaining. And all of our frogs here breed in aquatic environments. Amphibians in general need aquatic environments to be able to reproduce, to have eggs in really moist if not submerged habitats. Um, and speaking of amphibian eggs, everybody knows sort of the frog and toad life cycle. You know, we learn it really early, but just wanted to, for continuity, have that here. So, following the life cycle of a southern leopard frog, we start off with a clump of eggs. Again, this is a true frog. True frogs tend to have egg masses or clumps of eggs. Spend about 1 to 3 weeks as an egg before hatching into a tadpole. Um, and then we get tadpoles start to develop limbs, starting with the hind limbs and then the forelimbs. And sort of the total span between tadpole hatching to a froglet getting ready to metamorphose, between 12 and 16 weeks on average, but it can vary quite a bit with the species and the habitat. There are some desert species that have evolved to transform really quickly to cope with uh, drying ponds. And then there are some species that, like bullfrogs, farther north can have a multiple year um, larval period. But eventually, once they've developed the limbs, the ta tail disappears, and we get an adult leopard frog, which is then begins the cycle anew. So I thought what we could do here is listen to some frog calls, and I hope this works because so much of how people encounter frogs in Durham is by hearing them. And sometimes there are frogs that people think might be insects or birds. Sometimes there are birds and insects that people think are frogs. Try to select a representative sample of the most common frogs and frog calls that you'll hear for each of the seasons, or winter, spring, and summer, which is really when we tend to have frogs calling around here. I thought we could listen to a little segment and talk about some of the frogs. We don't have, this is not obviously going to be all of the frogs that are around here, just a few that you're most likely to hear. So starting with two that call during the winter months. So spring peepers, here they're winter peepers, and upland chorus frogs are two frogs in the Hylidae family, so tree frog family. And they're really small and they're really closely related to each other. And they have really loud calls. They're different calls, really distinctive calls, and they both call largely during the winter time into the early spring, but spring peepers can even begin calling in the late fall. You know, sometimes you'll hear them in November or December, but it's largely like January, February as you start to get those first sort of warm rains of spring. And I will play the spring peeper call first, and I hope that the sound works. All right. I hope that went through, and we'll try upland chorus frog. Okay, I'm seeing a thumbs up. Great. Thank you. Upland chorus frogs, um, to me sound like sort of running your finger down a comb. See if that analogy works for other folks. Uh, all right. So two closely related winter frogs. They look kind of similar, but pretty distinctive calls. Spring peeper is like a peep sound. Chorus frog is like a comb. And if you're in the midst of a big group of these frogs calling, it can be pretty deafening. So tiny but mighty for sure. If we move into, all right, come on now. There we go. If we move into spring, there's a number of frog species that can call sort of in the spring, moving into the early summer. I put a lot of those on the next slide. Two that I think of that I really associate with sort of the time of year that we're in right now are southern leopard frogs, which are a true frog, and I can't think of a good way to describe their call. It's a really complex call for it's one of our most complex calling frogs, and I'll let it speak for itself. So sort of like a almost a clucking sort of sound. They tend to breed in our larger wetlands and ponds right at this time of year. Um, I haven't heard any calling right along the Eno. They tend to not be as numerous right along the Eno as some of our other true frogs, like bullfrogs and green frogs. But I've heard some pretty sizable breeding congregations up along the Flat River and some of those large wetlands. And then American toads. So there are explosive breeders. They should be calling right about now, depending where you are in the triangle. And they have a really distinctive sort of extended trill call that sounds like this. So several frogs and toads that we have locally have a trill call that sounds similar to that. But the American toad is the most extended. It's a really long, relatively long trill. It can be several seconds. Um, and again, those are explosive breeders. They tend to congregate in ponds and vernal pools in large groups right around the same time. They tend to have really large breeding aggregations. And then there's a whole bunch of anurans that we can get sort of late spring moving into summer. Again, some of these are sort of spring-ish, but I wanted to include a lot of these on here because there's a great variety that you can hear as we move into the warmer months. So I think what a lot of people think of when they think of a summer frog is the bullfrog. Sounds like this. So sort of low frequency calling. Some people, if you write it out, people write out like jug of rum or something. It doesn't sound like that to me. So there's got to be a better way to describe that call. But just that low frequency repeated note is a bullfrog. Sort of similar if we move counterclockwise here from the bottom. Green frog, which I included this picture because green frogs are not always green, confusingly, and they look a lot like bullfrogs. The way to distinguish a green frog from a bullfrog is these dorsolateral ridges, they're called, these ridges from behind the eyes that go down the sides of the back. Green frogs have them, and bullfrogs do not. That's the best way. Bullfrogs also tend to be larger as adults. These are both true frogs. They're both really abundant, especially in areas of the Eno watershed where there's standing water. So green frog um, sounds like this. Um, so our prolonged breed about the summertime, some of the calls that I hear the most around the Eno are these two species. So those are good ones to know. Um, another really small species is the cricket frog. These are only, maybe an inch. They max out about an inch, and you almost never see them because they're so cryptic. But you do hear them. They tend to breed in these large aggregations, and it sounds like, to me, if you're like clicking marbles together, is what their call sounds like. So we'll see if everybody agrees, if it works for me. So one of our more subtle calls, a little quieter, a little harder to hear. But you do hear them, especially in sort of, again, ponds and vernal pools. As we move into later spring, we start to hear cricket frogs. I've already heard a few calling here and there, a little farther south in North Carolina. So they're starting up. Um, another hyelid frog that we have, another tree frog, probably the most common tree frog in the Eno is the Cope's gray tree frog. We have a couple other tree frog species that you can see here, but the majority of the tree frogs are Cope's gray tree frog. They're another one of the species that has sort of a trilling call. But if you listen to it relative to the American toad, Cope's gray tree frog has a much shorter trill than the American toad. So it sounds like this. Um, there's other things that can confound that call, and frog calls in general. It's also partly like temperature dependent. Um, Frogs call at lower frequencies, and the calls themselves are slower when it's colder out. Um, Frog calling is actually a really energy intensive process for frogs, especially if you think about it as something that frogs are doing. At least some species are doing as they emerge from a period of inactivity in the wintertime and they're starting to call sometimes on an empty stomach. It's really, really taxing for them. And and I've heard of instances of them calling so much that they die from exhaustion. So it's quite a process. And then this last one here that's less common on the Eno, but it's my personal favorite of the calls is the narrowmouth toad, another tiny but mighty species. If you got headphones in, this might be a little bit louder, just a heads up. I do like that call. I haven't seen them around the Eno, but I have heard narrowmouth toads, and they are here. So I hope you guys get a chance to see them in the wild. Again, not a true toad. Um, it's a frog. Let's hope it. All right. Okay. There we go. Got a little frog chorus there. So I want to touch on a little bit of a ecology because you mentioned that they occupy these diverse um, niches. And I want to talk about what that looks like along the Eno. So basically, every habitat that you could imagine in the Eno River watershed, from upland forest down here to large wetlands to the main stem of the Eno River, is occupied um, at least seasonally by one or more species of anurin. Um, you tend to see the largest diversities, like I mentioned, in larger wetlands. Um, I cheated a little bit here because I think this is in the Ellerby Creek watershed. This is not. I think this is the Beaver Marsh, not in the Eno, but uh, places like that, large wetlands, vernal pools, areas with standing water. But we do see green frogs and bullfrogs right in the main stem of the Eno River. And then moving into upland forest in areas around Cox Mountain or Occoneechee Mountain, lots of American toads and Fowler's toads um, that are in those terrestrial environments sort of year round. Um, and because they're in those diverse ecosystems, they have really important roles in food webs, both as predators and prey. And if you think about it in terms of having this two-part life cycle where you have totally different ecological roles as a juvenile and as adult, it's really amazing how broadly um, frogs can have a role in food chains. So frogs and toads start out as these tadpoles, which are almost exclusively herbivorous, and they're a really important food source um, for a number of animals, including other frogs. So other frogs and salamanders will eat tadpoles. Um, there are species of tadpoles out west that are carnivorous, but our tadpoles locally tend to be um, uh, primarily herbivorous. And then as an adult, frogs are carnivorous. Again, there's a few species of frogs that might be omnivorous, but by and large, all frogs are primarily carnivorous. And we have a huge range in size of adult frogs here, from those tiny little spring peepers and chorus frogs and cricket frogs that are primarily eating really small invertebrates, all the way up to bullfrogs, which are, can be high up on the food chain, especially in a small ecosystem like a vernal pool. They can eat things like snakes and other frogs. And I've even heard instances of bullfrogs going after birds. So in areas where bullfrogs have been introduced outside their range, they can actually be very devastating on native populations of animals. And there's also a seasonal component to Anuran habitat. So we have these breeding aggregations that are concentrated usually around standing water. Um, and things like toads especially are sort of more migratory. Migratory is not the right word, but they do move between um, breeding habitats and summering habitats. They tend to spend most of the season in these upland forested habitats and travel to and from breeding habitats during the spring. And that means that they're occupying a larger portion of the Eno River watershed, and it also means that they're coming into contact with humans more often and cars. So amphibians have a huge degree of road mortality during the spring, especially. So just keep that in mind as you're driving along the roads, especially on warm, rainy evenings, because you're likely to see frogs and toads and salamanders crossing the roads. I also wanted to mention that anurans have a really important role as bioindicators. It's sort of canaries in the coal mine um, globally for any sort of environmental degradation that's occurring because of this complex life cycle, starting in aquatic environments and ending up in more terrestrial environments, and because of how permeable and thin their skin is. So frogs both respire and drink, at least in part through their skin. Uh, they're really sensitive to any kind of pollutant or climate change. Um, and they can tell us a lot about the health of an ecosystem. So when we go out into an ecosystem along the Eno, we see a diverse population of frogs. We know it's doing pretty well. We know the water quality is good. We know it's not overly disturbed, but if we go out to areas where the frog populations are hurting, we know that the river is degraded in some way. And just real quick, these eggs up here on the top left are toad eggs. I think they're American toad eggs, but you can see how they have these strands rather than clumps like a true frog. Um, and in light of them being really sensitive to environmental degradation and human pressure, I wanted to talk a little bit about frog conservation concerns because amphibians are the most threatened group of animals in the world. I think I read something like 40% of amphibians are threatened or vulnerable in some way. So it's a huge number of global amphibians. This map shows where you have it's a map of the number of threatened amphibian species. So the highest number, which are darker colors of threatened species, tend to be around tropical latitudes and also on islands like the Caribbean and Madagascar. Um, and uh, Big threats, obviously things like anthropogenic direct disturbance, habitat loss, pollution, um, deforestation, all big threats. Climate change is a huge threat. And then chytrid fungus. So amphibians have this fungus called chytrid fungus. It spreads really readily between amphibians and it can be lethal, and entire populations and species have been wiped out by this fungus. And I mentioned climate change. Here's another map from a recent study that shows on the left-hand side the predicted losses. So darker colors are more species lost, and on the right-hand side, predicted gains. So darker colors are more species gained of amphibians because of climate change by 2100. And this just focuses on the Americas where they collected data. As you can see, that on the left-hand side, these losses are concentrated in areas where we already have higher diversities of threatened animals. So southeastern United States, Central America, northern and western South America. So we're going to be losing a lot of these species because of climate change. Where we're gaining species is primarily at really northern latitudes. So species that shift northward, right, into areas that become more climatically suitable for them, and then down here in these high elevations areas where they can migrate up into cooler areas to escape warming temperatures. But unfortunately, frogs that are, these really threatened species of amphibians down here are not going to be able to transplant up to these northern latitudes, right? So the threatened species that are on islands and in lowland areas and in areas that are in these tropical latitudes are largely going to be out of luck. So climate change is a really big and existential threat to our amphibian populations. I don't want to end on that note. Just about done here, but I want to end on a positive note because I think there is still hope. There are things that are going well in amphibian conservation, both at a local and global scale. Just when we talk about the Eno, I want to talk about the Eno River Association specifically, and just a plug for our work in amphibian conservation. Our organization alone, even though we're a small region, a small watershed, has protected nearly 8,000 acres since it was formed. And a lot of these acres of green space are along the Eno River, which forms sort of a natural wildlife corridor. And this figure on the right here is from the Triangle Connectivity Collaborative. It's a collective of land trusts and land managers that are working to create as much connected green space in the triangle as possible. And you can see that there's already been a number of these wildlife corridors that are starting to form out of this protected green space. And wildlife corridors are key to climate resilience because they provide a route through which populations can shift as the climate changes. So that will be key to preserving our amphibian diversity. And there's a long way to go, but there's already been a lot of good work done protecting these corridors. There's things that you can do in your yard and at your house to help protect amphibians. So one thing that folks can do is just make your yard more amphibian friendly by leaving your leaves on the ground. Holds moisture on the ground better. It creates a micro habitat for amphibians. If you have pools, cover your pools. Um, Typically, the really perfect looking manicured lawns are the ones that are the worst for amphibian habitats. They tend to use often pesticides or herbicides, which are obviously not good for amphibians because of their permeable skin. They tend to not have as much of that microhabitat that amphibians will use. So making your yards amphibian friendly is a great one. Um, and keeping cats and dogs either inside or on a leash. Domestic animals, domestic cats and dogs are huge pressures on frog and toad populations. They eat a lot of anurans every year, especially cats that are just left to roam outside at night. So keeping them inside or on a leash is a great start to helping protect our populations. And I just wanted to plug a couple of organizations that are local here in North Carolina that are doing great work specifically around amphibians and reptiles. So one of these is a nonprofit called the Amphibian and Reptile Conservancy, which is based in North Carolina but does work on threatened amphibian and reptile species throughout the United States. I recommend checking out their website. They're doing great work, and donating to them is a great way to further conservation efforts. And then also the North Carolina Herpetological Society, which is does work throughout the state, a lot of conservation work, but also a lot of outreach and education and advocacy work, both of which are doing uh, great uh, great work conserving our anurans. So there is still hope. There's great work being done, and there's ways that y'all can get involved at a micro scale. So I want to end on that. With that, I'd like to open it up for any sort of questions that folks might have. And I guess we can stop the recording here as well.
Yeah, I'll
Um,
stop that. Somebody did ask, Irene asked if for you to mention the name of the corridor organization. I think you mentioned,
yeah,
and I wasn't sure.
it's called the Triangle Connectivity Collaborative.
Oh, right. Yeah.
So I know that
Triangle.
conservation director was really involved with that. I think there's been folks from Triangle Land Conservancy and other land trusts, but then also like the state and local governments working as part of that. And they've got, I think, a website that's worth checking out.